As a queer person, do you think you had good sex education in school?
Not really.
Do you think you got good sex education as a queer person?
No.
In 1981, many cases of rare cancers and infections began to spread among groups of people in New York and California. By the end of the year, there were 270 reported cases of severe immune deficiency among gay men, and 121 people had already died of AIDS by the end of that year. June of 1982, a group of cases among gay men in California suggested that the cause of the immune deficiency was sexually transmitted. It was initially called gay-related immune deficiency, also known as GRID. The CDC then used the term AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, for the first time. By the next year, AIDS was reported among the female partners whose male partners also carried the disease, which led to the conclusion that it could be spread through any form of sex, no matter who was having it. But it had already been spread by the media and communities that it was a disease that only gay men had, and the fear of homosexuality became reasoned with the idea of a sexually spread illness. Also in that year, the first reports of AIDS in children led to the conclusion that it could be passed through by the mother during development in the womb. The CDC published their first set of recommended precautions for healthcare workers and allied health professionals to prevent the transmission of AIDS. By the end of 1983, the numbers of AIDS cases had risen to 3,064, and 1,292 people had died because of it. Despite many cases of HIV/AIDS in straight women and men, the origins of HIV/AIDS in the queer community created a stigma that exists to this day. This labeled queer people, and specifically queer men and other queer people who have anal sex, as dirty and promiscuous, a label that has created a new era of homophobia. The links between the infection of queer people and drug users led many to believe that this was God's punishment for those who had sinned. Homophobia's relation with the AIDS epidemic didn't only have social consequences. This led to a lack of governmental action on this crisis. Where the government failed, though, people stepped up. At the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, Cleve Jones, a gay activist centered in San Francisco, created the first of many quilt panels that turned into the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. People sent in panels from all over the United States, each one dedicated to someone lost to HIV or AIDS. This quilt toured the country, raising around $500,000 for HIV/AIDS resources, and was displayed in the National Mall. Weighing 54 tons, or 108,000 pounds, this quilt raised awareness for and humanized thousands of victims of this epidemic.
Chet, Hank and Larry, John, Michael, Terry Baker, Brad Bevis, Dr. Thomas Waddell.
Wade Walker, volunteer check-in coordinator, the NAMES Project.
Key figures in breaking down the stigma around HIV and AIDS include Magic Johnson, who was the first non-gay man who was married with a wife and kids to come out as HIV positive. He changed the public's thinking about HIV/AIDS for good. Another key figure was Princess Diana, who spoke on HIV and AIDS and decreased fear around people with HIV and AIDS.
HIV does not make people dangerous to know, so you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it.
Now, things like antiretroviral therapy have allowed many to live safely with HIV and AIDS and have decreased risks of infection. Knowledge about how to access sources for treatment fast play a big role in one's ability to catch HIV and other STDs early on and receive treatment. There has also recently been the second case of HIV/AIDS cured through bone marrow transplant, giving hope for a future of extremely low HIV/AIDS mortality.
Most people are familiar with sexualities such as heterosexual or straight, homosexual or gay/lesbian, and even bisexual, but there are many that are completely excluded from sex education in school, thus leaving many ignorant to their existence and prevalence. The same can be said generally for gender identities that apply to people who are not cisgender or assigned at birth a sex that matches their gender identity. Here are a few sexualities and genders many people are less familiar with. Keep in mind this is not a comprehensive list. Number 1 is asexuality. There are numerous variations of this sexuality, ranging from asexuals who are repulsed by sex and those who are happily willing to participate in sexual acts to please their partners, or asexuals who merely don't experience sexual attraction towards other people, but are capable of experiencing sexual pleasure. Individuals who lie in between asexuality and sexual attraction often identify as gray asexual. This sexuality is similar to, but not to be confused with, aromanticism, which is a lack of romantic attraction. These two are not mutually exclusive, nor are they unable to be paired. Both asexuality and aromanticism remain heavily stigmatized and stereotypes. Asexuals are frequently categorized as traumatized, though their identities are valid despite the existence of a mental illness or lack thereof. Bisexuality is characterized by attraction to two or more genders. Bisexuality and pansexuality are similar, however they are defined differently. Pansexuality is attraction towards people individually, regardless of gender. Demisexuality is a general inability to experience sexual attraction until a strong emotional connection with someone is formed. Being demi-romantic is similar, but affects romantic attraction instead of sexual. Non-binary is an umbrella term used for individuals who do not identify with either or identify with both traditional genders. The word genderqueer is often analogous to non-binary when used by members of the community. Within this lies a spectrum of genders one may identify with. Here are a few common genders. en.protothema.gr explains that someone who is agender identifies with no gender or with the absence of a gender. Gender fluidity is when one experiences change in flexibility or fluidity in their gender. Depending on the person, pronouns could fluctuate as well. The safest way to learn someone's preferred pronouns is always to ask politely. Finally, one that most people have heard of is transgender.
In Washington, since 2007, there has been a bill called Healthy Youth Act, which requires medically accurate sexual health education. However, this bill does not require schools to provide actual teaching surrounding these topics, and the guidelines are extremely vague, such as simply requiring to focus on abstinence and other forms of preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, continuing to dismiss every other aspect of sex education that would make it inclusive and detailed. Even though in Washington we have a mandatory sex education curriculum, it is not inclusive and starts much later in a child's mental and physical development. This bill, requested by State Superintendent Public of Instruction Chris Reckadell, would require children in public schools to be taught age-appropriate sex, gender, and consent education, starting in kindergarten.
In the Seattle District, Family Life and Sexual Health, or FLASH, stands as the current sexual education guideline. For primary and middle school, this program entails lessons on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender roles, the reproductive system, pregnancy, HIV and AIDS, and many other topics. Seattle is very privileged in its access to LGBTQ+ education and care. However, many LGBTQ students still feel their experience in sexual education was less than fulfilling. What was your experience with sex education in elementary school?
I actually didn't have any.
Didn't show queer people at all. I think 5th grade we had FLASH, which was like family life and sexual health. And I think it was overall pretty useful and helpful.
It was very generic. It was the anatomy, and that's all I remember besides other people's reactions.
And what about middle school?
6th grade, we watched Hank Green crash course videos as our sex ed. And 7th and 8th grade, we had this guy come in who was gay, but he only talked about how he had HIV and how to prevent HIV. And so my only representation of like queer people in sex ed was someone talking about how they have an STD.
It was super, like, heteronormative, and there was absolutely, it was very, what's the word, like, basic. It was super simplified, and most of the sex ed I know now, I had to be taught, like, I had to teach it to myself through, like, the internet or through, like, even adults that I know. I had a friend who was trans in my sex ed class, actually. We always would stop and, like, talk after it, but neither of us really knew anything, so it was mostly just us, like, speculating about what we should have been taught and, like, wondering what we were missing out on.
That's awful. And what do you think sex ed should look like as a general, guideline for LGBTQ curriculums?
I think it should include education about forms of birth control, forms of, like, STI prevention besides condoms, because there are other ones. It should include education about queer sex, the changes that, like, trans people's bodies go through when they do hormone replacement therapy. It should include talks about, like, polyamory. It should include talks about how it's okay to not feel sexual attraction at all. It should include intersex people. It should generally include more things than don't get pregnant.
And when do you think that they should start teaching sex ed or some gender or age-appropriate form of sex ed?
4th or 5th grade, I think.
Okay.
Because that's generally around the time this starts happening. I think kids should be taught about being trans or being queer earlier than that, aside from sex ed, as kind of part of its own little unit. They don't necessarily need sex ed until they, like, hit puberty and start figuring that out.
Okay. What is your experience with your current school sex ed, and also, like, how does your school navigate LGBTQ sex ed?
They don't. Our Pride Club works pretty hard on that. They're trying to get, like, more LGBTQ education into, like, our health and history curriculums. But so far that hasn't gone through at all. And when I was actually in health in my freshman year, my teacher tried to be super, like, nice, but all of her materials were super outdated. There was nothing she could really do about that, as accepting as she tried to be. Just she didn't have the right materials for it.
The only time I did was freshman year. And that was really warped because I went to a Christian school where they definitely didn't teach queer sex education because they didn't believe in it. They didn't believe it was right. A lot of, like, the questions you, like, write down were all super jokey, or like the private ones you sent were all super, like, there were a lot of, like, homophobic ones, and that was, like, really off-putting for someone who just wanted to know how it works, because I remember teaching it to myself online, and that's how,
We had a, like, week-long sexual health class in science. It mostly talked about STDs and stuff. I think it was only in 6th and 7th grade, but it might have been in 8th too. And it was essentially use a condom, don't have sex, but if you do, be safe. If you think anything's up, go like get that checked out. It didn't really talk about like resources and like where you could get help or like the specifics of it. It just was like sex was just like a vague kind of dangerous thing. And once again, it didn't at all talk about queer people and our sexual lives and how that works and like how to be safe with that.
I went to a Catholic school, in a Catholic elementary school, and we didn't really have sex education at all. That wasn't something that was in our curriculum. It wasn't until I went to public school that we had some type of sex ed, and it was very basic when I was going to school.
It needs to be as comprehensive and inclusive as possible and to represent all families and lives and walks of life. And to just, I don't know, be a more open and educating place and to be less sort of taboo.
I know this is super unrealistic, but I think an open discussion is the best way to go about it. If we have an open discussion about sex ed and what happens, then I think it's the best way of learning. I think also if we have just every once in a while a few queer speakers come in and talk about their experience about not just sex, but like coming out and like their process of how they adjusted to life, I think that'd be super nice for someone who is just coming out or who doesn't know if they're queer and would like to know more.
I think that it's better to introduce sex ed to children at an earlier age, and I think that kids should be taught about sex ed in a way that it doesn't embarrass them, and I think it should be open where they feel like they can communicate and they could ask the questions. I think in our society today that gender is very fluid, and teaching people that they can be fluid and that it doesn't matter how they express themselves. But I also think boundaries are really important. Kids being exposed to that at an earlier age helps them grow up to be more open and understanding to other people's gender or how their identity, you know.
A 2011 GLSEN National School Climate Survey showed only 4% of LGBT students were taught positive information about LGBT people or issues in their health classes, and nearly 3/4 of LGBT students heard homophobic or sexist remarks frequently at school. 38.3% of LGBT students had been physically harassed at school because of their sexual orientation, and 11.2% reported that this harassment occurred often or frequently.
Without proper education, millions of queer youth go into sexual experiences without protection. Lack of knowledge about risk factors has evidently had negative impacts on the queer community, as 1 in every 2 trans women is HIV positive, something that has been proven to decrease with proper sex ed, although admittedly these rates are also heightened due to sexual violence against trans women. With the implementation of education about safe queer sex, more protection against STDs is used when the risk of pregnancy is not a motivator. Also, queer sex education has been proven to decrease LGBTQ+ push-out in schools, the phenomenon of queer kids having higher dropout rates and lower GPAs than their straight counterparts. This would also have a positive impact for racial justice as well as Black and Latinx queers, who are more likely to contract diseases like HIV/AIDS and are more likely to die from it. As allies, accomplices, and members of the LGBTQ+ community that are able to speak out, the act of being aware of this layered topic and its importance will enable the younger generations to be the voice for those who need sex, gender, and consent education that is not only scientifically accurate, but does not continue to sweep these detrimental disparities under the rug. Making the discussions of sex in every form open and safe topic for everyone will do a lot of good with few to no consequences. making sure to dig deeper into who it can affect even more dangerously and
Stop. I'm sorry,
making sure to dig deeper into who this education can affect and how to use one's privilege when it comes to lives of queer children across the world will only make the world a better place for everyone.